A few years ago in Scotland, a couple of friends and I took a night bus from Liverpool to Dumfries, gearing up for a week of camping in the wild. Unlike traditional camping with tents, wild camping involves creating a simple shelter out of ponchos or tarps and then sleeping on the ground. It's tough, but that's part of the appeal. Around 5 a.m., with barely any sleep, we found ourselves stumbling through the Scottish countryside. We managed to take a wrong turn almost immediately, facing about 6.5 miles or 9 hours of walking. I couldn't believe we'd messed up so soon, despite the early hour. We looked like quite the odd group when we flagged down a passing cyclist to ask for directions. He was friendly, helped us out, and soon we were on track again. As we rounded a corner, we spotted a war memorial, a useful landmark for navigation. The silence there was broken only by some low sounds of the countryside, so we decided to set down our packs on benches near the memorial and rest. This spot was at a crossroads, which reminded me of old stories about people being buried at crossroads, giving me an odd, unsettling feeling. Under the warm, golden light of early morning, we continued southwest toward Gargan Bridge. The roadside was narrow, so we often had to step onto the road. To our left, we saw our first rabbit, which we took as a lucky sign. We mimed aiming and shooting at it with our fingers, making sounds and joking around until it spotted us and dashed into the bushes. Carrying on, we passed a rather garish sign for a stone cottage that featured 2 fake-looking swords. One of us muttered, "Only in Scotland." Eventually, we reached Gargan Bridge and crossed over a small stream near an old blacksmith's shop. Moving uphill past a local high school, we followed a farm track. Making good time, we passed grazing animals, though the fields were quiet without any farmhands in sight. The farmer's house was neat, but the cattle shed nearby looked worn down, likely inhabited by bats and other wildlife. Sheep and young lambs noticed us and darted away. Navigating past the cattle shed, we clambered over a couple of fences to avoid a large tank of farm waste. This detour led us to another fence, an electrified one. "Is this electric?" someone asked. Following the wire with my eyes, I spotted a battery unit nearby, too high to jump over and impossible to crawl under with our heavy packs. I grimaced at the idea of touching it. I grabbed a large piece of wood and, avoiding fresh cow dung like landmines, used the wood to pin down the fence so we could step over it. As I crossed, I heard a faint buzzing. After that, we trudged across 2 more fields, climbing fences between them. I took out my phone to record the climb as we ascended the first of many hills. The packs felt twice as heavy as we leaned forward, taking small, labored steps to maintain balance. By the time we reached the steepest part, the joke stopped, and we silently focused on pushing ourselves up the hill. I was starving when we finally arrived at our planned rest stop, close to where we'd camped on a previous trip. We dropped our packs, sore from the trek, as my friend Corky took off his soaked shirt, steam visibly rising from his shoulders. "Look at that!" Martin, our other friend, laughed, pointing out the steam. We all laughed, taking out food and tobacco. Martin and I had oatcakes with cheese spread, and we shared coffee brewed from a small portable stove, which would become our lifeline over the next week. Corky changed into dry clothes and eyed a can of breakfast beans, reading off the ingredients while we relaxed in the cool shade, taking in the view and smoking. It was only 7 a.m., but we felt like it was later due to the lack of sleep. We estimated we'd reach our next destination by around 10 a.m., but Corky wasn't sure we'd make it, still wary from our earlier wrong turn. After trekking steadily over the ridge, we finally reached a small cluster of houses, another key landmark. Deciding to take a shortcut, we crossed a field of cows, partially to avoid a different electric fence. Halfway across, we noticed the cows watching us. At first, their stares didn't seem intimidating, but as more cows turned their heads to look, I slowed down. "They're watching us," I said. "They're just curious," Martin replied, but the cows kept coming closer, then broke into a trot, then a clumsy run. Alarmed, Corky started to back away, and I looked around for an escape. "Run!" he shouted, but our heavy packs made any attempt at running a hobble. I glanced at an enclosure with an electric fence, deciding that a shock might be better than getting trampled. "Don't run!" Martin yelled, and my body reacted immediately. We stopped, turned, and spread our arms wide to appear bigger. The cows slowed down, some stopping, while the rest seemed to hesitate. A voice called from the other side of the field. It was the farmer, telling us to walk along the edge of the field to the gate. Following his directions, we moved slowly, arms outstretched, while the cows crowded around for a closer look. They jostled and even climbed over each other to see us, but we stayed calm, repeating to ourselves that everything was fine. Finally, we climbed over the gate, relieved. The farmer was still there, telling us the cows were just curious. "Just keep along this road here and you'll be fine," he said, giving us directions to our next stop. Since then, every time I tell the story, people laugh, but it really scared us at the time. We learned later that cows are actually responsible for more yearly deaths than sharks, often due to hikers cutting through fields and getting trampled. So, the next time you think about taking a shortcut across a field, make sure it's empty. You might just avoid an unexpected scare. Once a year, my stepdad's family holds a small camping reunion down in North Carolina. My mom's been married to him for nearly 5 years now, so I've been to a few of these gatherings when my job schedule allows. The first one I attended was soon after their wedding. With just my younger sister and me, we packed my stepdad's SUV with camping supplies and set off for the 8-hour drive from our home in Cincinnati to his hometown in North Carolina. We just crossed into Kentucky when we made our first stop to fuel up. We all hopped out of the SUV to stretch and used the restroom while my stepdad handed an elderly attendant some cash to pump the gas. After I returned from the restroom, I started chatting with the attendant, who was friendly at first, asking where we were going and for how long. But when I mentioned camping, his expression changed. "Always show respect in the wild," he cautioned. "Nature doesn't forgive. Leave only your footprints, no trash. The forest has its way of letting you know if you're unwelcome." I assured him we'd be careful and clean up after ourselves, but he didn't seem reassured. Once he finished, he quietly returned to his seat. Several hours later, deep into North Carolina, we made another rest stop close to the campground. This place was a wildlife preserve that doubled as a truck stop, with an information board about local animals and plants. In the corner of the board, I noticed the words "Respect Nature" scratched into the plastic, the exact words that the gas station attendant had told me. It was eerie, but I chalked it up to coincidence. After all, he was far from here by now. I decided not to mention it to my mom or stepdad, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks. We eventually reached the campsite, greeted the extended family with hugs, and started setting up a large, comfortable tent where we'd be staying. Afterward, we joined everyone for barbecue. My stepdad's family was just as kind as he was, and I have to say he was a much better role model than my real dad. I was glad my mom had found someone so supportive and good for her. That night, we gathered around a fire while my step-uncle played guitar and sang old songs. When it was time to turn in, we headed to our tent, but found something on the grass at the entrance: a dead bird. My sister was disturbed. The bird had started to decay, and a heavy, awful smell hung around. My stepdad joked to lighten the mood, then used a stick to remove the bird from the campsite. I noticed him pulling something from under its wing. A note, maybe. When I asked, he shrugged it off, claiming he didn't find anything, but his expression seemed unsettled. The next morning, some family members mentioned hearing footsteps outside their tents in the early hours. They tried to find out if anyone had been wandering or sleepwalking, but no one claimed responsibility. This made everyone a bit uneasy. The second night was less eventful, with no mysterious footsteps. But in the middle of the night, I woke up to my sister's voice in the dark. It sounded like she was talking to herself, which wasn't unusual for her. But there was no flashlight, no book. I strained my ears to hear and finally recognized what she was whispering. It was a word-for-word recital of the information from the wildlife board we'd seen at the rest stop. She was using terms I knew she didn't know. Eventually, she went quiet, but I was too unsettled to fall back asleep. The next morning, I awoke to my stepdad's voice sounding tense. I stepped outside to see everyone packing up in silence, though we'd planned to stay another few nights. My stepdad asked me to help load up quickly, and his expression made it clear I shouldn't ask questions. By noon, we were on the road back to Ohio. Relieved, I kept quiet on the way home, though I was bursting with questions about what had happened. I wanted to know what my stepdad had found under the bird, but I waited until we got home. Later that evening, I found my stepdad alone in the living room. He guessed my question before I asked and admitted there was a note with the bird. It had said, "Leave now." He dismissed it as a prank, maybe by teenagers or by a cousin who didn't like that he'd moved north, so he'd ignored it. I asked if he'd heard my sister's strange sleep talking, but from his confused look, I knew he hadn't. Then he told me what had actually caused everyone to leave so suddenly. A cousin he suspected of leaving the note had woken up early, stepped out to relieve himself, and saw something near the fire pit. A dead deer, left as some kind of message. He woke my stepdad to help move it before others saw, but that wasn't the most disturbing part. Whoever had left the deer had carved something into its skin while it was still alive, as the cuts were marked with clotted blood, not fresh wounds. Just 2 words. I asked what they said. He sighed, unable to meet my eyes. "Final warning," he replied. "Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell to be notified about future stories. Got a story to share? Submit it to my forum, and it might be featured in the next episode. Join my community to discuss and share stories directly. And if you want to support my work, consider early access on Patreon for just $1 per month or check out the merch. For longer stories, tune in to my podcast on Spotify or Apple. Thanks again, and see you next time. A group of friends went on a camping trip in the rugged highlands of northern Scotland. The journey was challenging. The weather was harsh, and the landscape was even more unforgiving. Still, the trip was a success. No one was injured or lost, and nothing remotely unsettling occurred. That is, until the last night. After 5 exhausting nights in the mountains, they returned to the small Scottish village where they were to catch a bus. By the time they arrived, they were completely drained, both physically and emotionally. Days of little food and sleep had left them in rough shape. When they saw a small, greasy cafe, they were almost moved to tears. They attracted some stares from the locals, but it was understandable. They were a mess with bloodshot eyes, unwashed hair, and smoky clothes from nights huddled around a campfire. The villagers were friendly, though, and the cafe owner chatted with them, showing pride in their admiration for the highlands. Full and warm, they left the cafe and headed to the only pub in town. The pub was equally welcoming, staying open an hour later than usual to let them stay warm while they waited for their late-night bus. With about 20 minutes before their bus was due, they thanked the bar staff and started toward the village's single bus stop, which was located next to a small bridge crossing the river. The streetlights in the village barely worked, casting dim glows, but they could still make out the bridge's outline. As they waited, the minutes ticked by, and they grew eager to get home to hot showers, soft beds, and a proper meal. Suddenly, they heard a grunting sound coming from the other side of the river. At first, they ignored it, assuming it was nothing. But the noise grew louder, sounding more like an angry voice. Eventually, curiosity got the better of one of them, who walked up the bridge to take a look. They could hear his heavy steps on the metal bridge, and moments later, he came hurrying back, panic in his eyes, whispering, "Grab your stuff now. Move," though initially thinking it was a prank. One look at his terrified face made them realize he was serious. Soon, they heard footsteps echoing across the bridge, getting closer. Someone was rushing toward them, making the same angry noises they'd heard before. Not taking any chances, they grabbed their bags and quickly moved into a dark alley, watching the bridge from their hiding place. Then they saw him, a man stumbling down the bridge with something metallic glinting in his hand. "Is that a machete?" One of them whispered in disbelief. As if sensing them, the man pointed the large blade toward their alley and shouted, "You!" before charging toward them. Without a second thought, they bolted, sprinting down the narrow, dark street. They didn't know where they were going, but anywhere seemed better than being near this armed stranger. Luckily, the one in the lead suggested they loop around the block so they wouldn't miss the bus. The bus schedule was limited, and the next one wouldn't come for days. Faced with the difficult choice of either risking a confrontation or being stranded in the middle of nowhere, they devised a plan to return to the bus stop cautiously. Moving in pairs, they covered each other as they made their way back. They thought they'd lost him and started to relax, but soon their anxiety returned. The bus was late, and they worried they might have missed it entirely. But before they could panic further, the same man appeared again from a nearby alley, still clutching the machete. "Oi!" he shouted as he slowly approached them. This time, desperation overrode their fear, and they decided to stand their ground. They shouted back, pulling out their tiny pocket knives, hoping to deter him. It was a tense standoff. He zigzagged toward them, machete raised, as they held their ground. Just when it felt like something terrible might happen, they saw a police van rounding the corner, headlights shining. It was as if help had arrived just in time. The man only noticed the police when they were almost upon him. The van screeched to a halt, and 3 officers jumped out, tackling him to the ground with a hard thud. The group cheered as nearby residents turned on their lights and peeked out of their windows to watch. Just then, their bus finally arrived. They gathered their bags and headed to it, feeling victorious. The police wanted to take their statements, but the group explained that this was their only ride out of town. They promised to follow up later, but were simply relieved to be leaving safely. One summer back in 2012, a few friends and I decided to set up a small camping trip in a forest just outside my friend's hometown. We chose a place similar to Willow Woods, small but perfect for a break from city life. Urban living can be nice, but the endless bustle can feel overwhelming, so any excuse to escape to nature was a relief. But as the camping trip date drew near, things began to fall apart. Friends started calling or texting, saying they couldn't come. Some had family issues, others were short on cash, and some just couldn't be bothered. In the end, only 2 of us decided to go. So, early one bright summer morning, we hopped on a train heading toward the forest. The weather was ideal. Clear skies and a gentle breeze made the forest hike far easier than expected. It didn't take us long to find a decent spot for camp, nestled in the shade near a stream that we could use for drinking water and washing. The only downside was that the spot was a bit open and easily visible. By late afternoon, worn out from the hike, we decided to start a fire for dinner. Setting up a small campfire is just part of the camping experience, but it can also draw attention. The smell of smoke and cooking food can travel, almost like you're sending an invitation to anyone nearby. Sure enough, as we anticipated, a group of locals eventually came across our campsite and approached to say hi. They seemed friendly at first, but I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. It's strange how our instincts can pick up on small details, whether it's body language or just something about the conversation that feels off. I couldn't tell if it was the way they kept glancing at each other or the odd questions they asked, but I sensed they didn't have the best intentions. When they eventually left out of earshot, my friend suggested we move to a new spot. Now, he's usually the jumpy one, the one I'm always telling to relax, but this time I felt he was right. It might have been paranoia, but in situations like this, it's always better to be safe. So, tired and slightly tipsy, we put out the fire, gathered our gear, and started looking for another spot. Fortunately, we found one pretty quickly, a densely wooded hill overlooking our old campsite. From a short walk away, we had a good view of the area during the daytime. As night fell, we set up a new fire, cooked some noodles in our mess tins, and settled down to drink and unwind. We laughed and chatted around the fire until we could barely keep our eyes open, eventually retreating to our poncho shelters. I must have fallen asleep as soon as I got into my sleeping bag, because the next thing I remember is waking up to the sound of a car engine revving in the distance. At first, I was just annoyed about being woken up, feeling rough from the night before, but the revving kept getting louder and louder, and I realized the car was getting closer. Something told me to go check it out. By the time I started hearing voices, I thought it might just be some teens joyriding, but I wanted to be cautious. When I reached the edge of the hill, I saw flashlight beams near our old campsite. Someone had driven down the path, right up to where we'd previously camped. It looked like they were searching for us. I moved quickly and quietly back to wake my friend. I think I explained what I saw 2 or 3 times before it registered with him, but once it did, he got up and helped me douse our fire. We grabbed binoculars from our pack and crept back to the hill's edge. We watched, horrified, as the people below shone their flashlights on each other, revealing that they held baseball bats, hammers, and even a length of rope. They looked angry, furious that they'd missed us. All we had were small pocket knives for defense. If they had decided to search the area thoroughly, they would have found us easily. I'm not sure I'd be here to share this story if they had. Luckily, they didn't seem motivated to look too hard. Perhaps they'd had a few drinks themselves or were just too lazy. But thankfully, they eventually left. My friend and I spent the rest of the night on edge, one of us keeping watch while the other packed up. The group below lingered around our old site, kicking at the remains of the fire we had left behind. They didn't seem eager to leave, but didn't attempt to search beyond that area. This left us stranded on the hill. Trying to escape with our heavy packs could have easily gotten us caught, especially since they had a vehicle. We stayed there until morning, unable to sleep. I kept dreading that they'd come back with more people, more lights, and more determination. But fortunately, they didn't. By the time we were on the train home, I was disappointed that we had to cut our trip short. But with those guys hanging around, neither of us wanted to risk it. When you travel, whether near or far, it's good to remember that while some people are kind strangers, others might not have the best intentions. From the first moments of my day, I'd either be camping or preparing for a trip. The fresh air and escape from the usual routines felt like a relief, a chance to avoid the trivial worries that occupied so much of daily life. I used to go pretty hardcore, building our own shelters, drinking from mountain creeks, and setting snares to catch food rather than carrying supplies. So, in the spring last year, 2 friends and I embarked on a 5-day trek along a remote section of a major trail. Carrying packs over 50 pounds, we hiked 15 miles into the rolling green hills before reaching our first large water source. A long, serene stretch of clear water nestled in a scenic valley. It took 2 days, hiking nearly 16 hours straight, and our packs were grinding painfully into our shoulders with every step. Still, the sense of accomplishment was exhilarating. As the days went by, we continued along the trail, gathering food here and there. It was exhausting, but the peace we found in nature was unmatched. At night, we roasted sausages over the fire and warmed cider in our pots. We listened to owls calling like spirits and watched sparks rise like fireflies in the night as our eyelids grew heavy. Though we found some berries and fresh water, we struggled to catch any significant protein. No luck with rabbit snares, no eggs to be found, and our fishing attempts fell short. We grew desperate, realizing we couldn't just live on snack bars and nuts. So, we decided to head into the nearest small town, around 6 miles away. However, after a couple of hours, we veered off course. We began climbing a steep hillside as a shortcut, watching a thick mist gather at the hilltop, waiting to descend on us as the temperature dropped. Eventually, it rolled down, cloaking everything around us. My friend Alex was barely visible as I trailed him through the fog. We tried to stay positive until we began seeing remains of newborn lambs on the ground. It was lambing season, so seeing a few would be normal, but the sheer number and untouched condition of these remains felt wrong. Relief washed over us when we finally saw the shape of a cottage in the distance. We hadn't seen it marked on our map and had no clue where we were. Exhausted, low on water, and hoping for guidance, we approached the cottage to ask for directions. We climbed over a low stone wall to reach it, noticing that there was no clear path to or from the house. At the gate, a makeshift thing held together with old nails and twine. Alex tried to open it, but it just fell apart in his hands. A small yard in front of the house was overgrown, with weeds poking through cracked pavement. Scattered around were random trinkets. Small toys, a tennis ball, a hairbrush, a dirty wheelbarrow with a few soggy books, and an action figure arranged oddly in a rough circle. We reached the front door, and I knocked firmly. The door rattled under my hand. As we waited, I peeked through a grimy window and saw random items strewn across shelves. I turned to Alex, suggesting we move on since it seemed no one was home. But he didn't answer. He looked pale and unsettled. He had been peering through the window and had gotten a clearer view inside. It seemed like he'd seen something he couldn't explain. Suddenly, he backed away, breathing heavily, and bolted from the courtyard. Surprised and uneasy, I yelled after him, asking what was wrong. He muttered, "We need to go, now." Later, by the campfire that night, I finally asked him what he'd seen in that cottage. Visibly shaken, he explained that he had seen someone inside, watching us. As I knocked, they had looked out the window and locked eyes with him. Alex described their face as horribly disfigured, either from an injury or something else, and said that they seemed terrified. He had felt an overwhelming sense of dread, realizing that someone, possibly something else as well, was likely nearby. And as grateful as we were for not finding out what it was, a chill lingered with us long after we left. A few friends and I decided we wanted to do something big for charity. We threw around ideas like shaving our heads, running a marathon, or putting together a local picnic, but none of those ideas seemed to get anyone excited enough to donate. We needed something unique to make an impact, something bold. That's when I came up with a crazy plan. Hike 18 miles into the Lake District and spend a week camping in the rough, pretending to live homeless. It sounded wild enough to attract donations, though I doubted my friends would actually agree. But surprisingly, they did. The pitch was simple: 7 days, 18 miles, roughing it for the homeless. With that, donations slowly started coming in. By the time we were set to go, we had raised over 1,200 pounds, around $1,500, for Shelter UK, a charity that supports people facing homelessness. We were proud yet nervous. The Lake District's rugged terrain can be brutal. It's often used by the British Army for training. And since we were going in early March, we expected rain, wind, and cold, so we spent quite a bit of our own money on military surplus gear, which was sturdy and affordable. We started our trek loaded with huge backpacks full of canned food and water. The weight was rough. Our shoulders, knees, feet, and backs were aching by mile 15. By then, two of my friends were ready to give up and suggested calling a taxi for the last few miles. One friend complained about how heavy his pack was, and I wondered what he'd packed to make it so unbearable. When we reached a lake to set up camp, I found out he'd brought an air rifle. Half his pack's weight was that pellet gun. I was annoyed, thinking maybe he could have pushed through if he'd left it, but at least we had some entertainment and maybe a shot at fresh game. After the exhausting first night, we relaxed by the lakeside fire, then woke at dawn thinking a morning hunt might yield a bird or rabbit. We didn't get a single shot off, but unexpectedly stumbled into someone. A half-asleep dog walker in the middle of nowhere. He seemed surprised and a bit nervous to see a few camo-clad guys, one holding what looked like a rifle, but he didn't ask any questions. We waved, he waved back, and we moved on. By the time we returned to camp for lunch, we'd mostly forgotten about him. Later, after a quiet day of gathering firewood and sharing stories, we finally settled in to sleep. A few hours later, I was jolted awake by torchlights outside our shelter. I heard a voice shout, "Armed police! Hands up!" Trembling, we crawled out of our tent one by one, hands raised, into the glare of 6 or 7 torches. I realized then that the lights were attached to the officers' firearms. My heart raced, terrified, as they ordered us to the ground. My friends and I lay flat on the cold ground as they searched our tent, quickly finding the air rifle. They questioned us, asking if we were military or pathfinders on maneuvers. We had to admit we were just 3 civilians on a charity challenge, camping rough to raise money for homelessness. One officer explained that the dog walker had seen us and thought we were soldiers, which is why they'd come out fully armed. They seemed somewhat impressed by our story, though I expected them to be upset over the misunderstanding. But as it turned out, this was no inconvenience for them. They got overtime pay, and these kinds of call-outs are a thrill. They confiscated the air rifle but left us with our camping gear, even though we lacked a fishing permit for the lake. They joked about smelling something funny, but didn't search further, letting us off with a warning. A few days later, we even managed to retrieve the air rifle. It still surprises me that we faced no charges. I like to think they were moved by our charity effort, though honestly, we just got lucky that night. It easily could have ended differently with one wrong move. Long ago, in the southern part of the United States, lies one of the largest untouched wildernesses, covering almost 2 million acres. It's renowned for its hunting opportunities and is thought to get its name from an ancient term meaning great hunt. During hunting season, the area is usually filled with brightly dressed hunters. But my friends and I, mostly from the East Coast and not into hunting, had a different plan. We heard that in the high summer months, hunting was banned, which meant we could explore the forests in peace. We set out from our hometown of Lowell, Massachusetts, for the Ouachita National Forest in Arkansas, stopping along the way in cities like Philadelphia and Nashville to make the long trip more bearable. By the time we reached Ouachita, we were ready to leave modern life behind, which, for us, meant enjoying drinks by the fire while singing songs as loudly as we could. By the second night, though, we'd run out of beer and snacks, and it was already late in the day. Outlaw Liquor, the closest store, was a tiny shack near a town called Crystal Springs. We walked for about 3 hours to get there, only to find the place stuffed with hunting trophies and run by a guy named Jerry. He let us sample local spirits, and we ended up buying more than we'd planned. Beers, homemade jerky, and even a strong stout called Abraxas. We started back to our campsite as the sun dipped below the horizon, aching from the walk but sipping on our drinks as we went. Every now and then, one of us would have to step off the path for a bathroom break. When it was my turn, I wandered a bit into the woods, but as I finished, I heard faint voices and footsteps nearby. In my tipsy state, I thought it would be fun to meet whoever was there. Pushing through the bushes, I stepped into a clearing, and my blood ran cold. There were 3 or 4 men, dressed in rough clothes, holding weapons, a mixture of knives and clubs. At their feet was a young woman, tied up and bruised. One of the men, seeing me, pressed a finger to his lips, silently telling me to stay quiet. I backed away slowly, then turned and bolted. My friends saw the look on my face and ran too. We didn't stop until we were gasping for breath. Once we were safe, I explained what I'd seen, sparking an argument over whether to call the cops. We decided to report it from the road, but not before we left the forest for safety. We made the call, describing the location as best we could. Though we never heard back, I still wonder what happened to that girl and hope she was rescued. But sometimes, I think that piece of forest holds something dark, as if that place took a part of her soul that night.